In the autumn of 2015, a case unfolded in Astana, the capital city of Kazakhstan, that would shake the country's sense of trust in human decency and leave an entire community questioning whether kindness itself had become a liability. It is a story about a young woman who believed in helping others, who opened her door and her life to someone she called a friend, and who paid for that generosity with everything she had. It is the kind of story that lingers long after the courtroom doors close, not only because of its cruelty, but because of the unanswered questions that continue to haunt the people who loved her most. Ulzhan Ryskulbekova was born into a warm and supportive family in the southern city of Shymkent, Kazakhstan. She was a deeply cherished child, the kind of daughter that parents speak about with quiet pride, surrounded by siblings in a household that valued compassion, education, and looking out for one another. Her family was financially comfortable by most measures, but Ulzhan never carried herself with the arrogance that sometimes comes with material ease. Those who knew her from childhood described a girl who was naturally generous, quick to notice when someone was struggling, and even quicker to offer whatever she could. She never looked down on anyone. She never turned away from a person in need. That instinct to give and to help would define her personality all the way through her short adult life, and it is part of what makes her story so devastating. From her earliest years in school, Ulzhan distinguished herself academically. She was the kind of student teachers remember fondly, not because she sought approval, but because she genuinely loved learning and brought real effort to every subject. By the time she reached her final years of secondary education, she had already begun planning her future with remarkable clarity. She knew she wanted a university degree, a professional career, and a life built on her own terms. She did not want to depend on her parents any longer than was absolutely necessary. She wanted to stand on her own, build her own path, and prove that ambition and hard work could take her wherever she chose to go. The institution she set her sights on was the Elen Gumilyov Eurasian National University in Astana, one of Kazakhstan's most respected universities. Choosing it meant leaving Shymkent and her entire family behind, relocating nearly 1,000 kilometers north to a city she barely knew. Her parents worried, as any parents would. Astana was a fast-growing, modern capital, and their daughter would be alone there. But Ulzhan's mind was made up. She studied hard, earned outstanding grades, passed her entrance examinations, and secured her place at the university without significant difficulty. By the end of summer 2011, she packed her belongings and made the journey north, stepping into an entirely new chapter of her life. Astana suited her immediately. The energy of a large, ambitious city matched her own restless drive. The university campus was filled with students from across Kazakhstan and beyond, and Ulzhan found it easy to connect with people. She built a circle of friends naturally, the kind of easy social intelligence that made her someone others wanted to be around. She studied diligently, never losing sight of why she had come, but she also embraced campus life fully, making friendships that she hoped would last a lifetime. Her first years were spent in a university dormitory, the shared corridors and communal routines of student housing that most young people experience during their first taste of independence. But as the semesters passed, Ulzhan began to feel that Astana was becoming home in a permanent way. She found herself imagining a future there, not just as a student, but as a working professional. The idea of returning to Shymkent after graduation began to feel less and less likely. By the time she reached her third year of study, she decided to move out of the dormitory and rent a private apartment closer to the university. Her parents supported the decision and covered her rent while she focused on her degree. Not long after, they took the additional step of purchasing a modest apartment for her in the same neighborhood, giving her real stability and a sense of settled belonging in the city she had come to love. Ulzhan entered her fourth year of study in the autumn of 2015 as a 21-year-old young woman with an impressive academic record and a reputation that extended well beyond her own immediate circle. Her lecturers regarded her as one of the most responsible and dedicated students in the program. Her fellow students respected her for the same reasons. She had served as her class representative, a role sometimes called a starosta in the post-Soviet academic tradition, since her very first year. It was a position of trust that reflected what everyone around her already knew, that Ulzhan was dependable, organized, and deeply committed to doing things properly. When she did not appear in class on the morning of October 10, 2015, it was noticed almost immediately. This was not a student who skipped lectures without reason, and she was certainly not someone who disappeared without letting people know. She always gave advance notice if something came up. She was always reachable. But on that Friday morning, her phone rang out and redirected every caller to voicemail, again and again, no matter how many times her classmates tried. Nobody had heard from her. Nobody knew where she was. Several hundred kilometers south in Shymkent, Ulzhan's mother was already consumed by a growing sense of dread. The two spoke every single day, sometimes multiple times, It was their routine, a lifeline that allowed the family to stay close despite the distance. Ulzhan always answered or called back within minutes if she had missed a call. She had never simply gone silent, but since the previous evening, her mother had been unable to reach her. By the morning of October 10th, the silence had become unbearable. Knowing that her daughter shared the apartment with a 23-year-old acquaintance, her mother tried reaching that young woman instead. Her name was Bayan Shalkarova. At first, Bayan did not pick up either. When she finally answered, the conversation offered no comfort and raised far more questions than it resolved. Bayan told Ulzhan's mother that she had moved out of the apartment several days earlier and had not been in contact with Ulzhan since. This was unexpected on multiple levels. Ulzhan had in fact been complaining to her family about Bayan for some time. The living arrangement had grown difficult, tensions had developed between them, and Ulzhan had reportedly wanted Bayan to leave the apartment, but Bayan had shown no intention of doing so. The claim that she had quietly moved out just a couple of weeks before Ulzhan's disappearance was inconsistent with everything Ulzhan's family knew about the situation. If Bayan had genuinely left, why had Ulzhan still been expressing frustration about her in the days that followed? The timeline did not add up. Bayan offered no clear answers to these questions, gave vague and evasive responses, and then abruptly ended the call. That conversation was enough. Ulzhan's mother contacted relatives who lived in Astana and asked them to go to the apartment immediately and check on the situation. The relatives arrived at the building that evening. They knocked on the door and rang the bell, but received no response. No one came to the door. Without a spare key, they had to wait while another family member was contacted and asked to bring one. Roughly an hour passed before the second relative arrived with the key and the door was unlocked. What greeted them inside was not what anyone had hoped to find. The apartment was in a state of visible disorder. Furniture had been overturned. Personal belongings were strewn across the floor. Several items of apparent value were missing. The scene carried the unmistakable character of a place where something had gone terribly wrong. There was also a considerable amount of disturbing evidence throughout the apartment, suggesting serious physical violence had taken place. Ulzhan herself was nowhere to be found. After a brief look around to confirm she was not there, the relatives made the right decision to leave the apartment as undisturbed as possible and contact law enforcement immediately. Officers arrived quickly and began a thorough examination of the scene. The evidence before them only deepened the concern. Among the items inside the apartment, investigators identified several objects that could have been used as weapons in an attack, both of them coated in dried, darkened stains consistent with significant physical violence. Still, the critical question of where Ulzhan was remained unanswered. Detectives began speaking with residents in the building, canvassing the floors above and below. Several neighbors recalled hearing disturbing noises coming from the direction of Ulzhan's apartment the previous evening, on October 9th. The timing varied from one account to the next, suggesting the disturbance may have continued for a period of time, or that different neighbors had been alerted at different points during a prolonged incident. Investigators then moved to check the building's security camera system, only to discover that no cameras had been installed inside the structure. It was a significant gap that complicated the investigation from the start, but then something useful surfaced. One neighbor mentioned that a large rolled carpet had appeared in the lower section of the building near the entrance to the basement. It had been there for at least a day. It seemed out of place, and although residents had noticed it, nobody had moved it or looked closely at it. Investigators descended to the basement level. The carpet was there, positioned near the basement entrance, heavy and bulky. Even at first glance, it was clear that something substantial had been rolled inside it. The outer surface of the carpet was marked with dark, irregular stains, and a trail of similar markings could be traced from the stairwell landing down to where the carpet now rested. A larger pooling of the same dark substance had gathered beneath it on the floor. Detectives carefully unrolled it, and the search for Ulzhan Ryskulbekova came to an end. Inside was the body of a young woman. She was identified without difficulty. She was 21 years old, a fourth-year university student, a class leader, someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. The medical examiner's findings painted a deeply troubling picture of what had happened in that apartment. Ulzhan had sustained a severe blunt force injury to her head, consistent with a heavy tool such as a hammer. The impact had fractured the bones of her skull and caused dangerous internal bleeding. It was a traumatic and potentially life-threatening wound on its own, but forensic analysis determined that this was not the injury that ultimately took her life. Also recovered from the apartment was a bladed weapon bearing traces of the same evidence. According to the post-mortem examination, Ulzhan had been fatally wounded by 27 separate injuries inflicted with that blade. The scope of what had taken place was staggering. Investigators also noted that despite the clear evidence of a significant physical confrontation within the apartment, the number of defensive injuries found on Ulzhan's body was relatively small. This detail was significant. It suggested either that the attack had been sudden and came without warning, or that the attacker was someone Ulzhan knew and perhaps had not immediately perceived as a threat. Forensic experts would later offer a more specific interpretation. The evidence indicated that the initial blow had been delivered from behind. If that assessment was accurate, Ulzhan had likely not seen the attack coming at all. She had not been given a chance to defend herself. While investigators processed the scene and the medical examiner completed his work, law enforcement moved quickly to identify and locate Bayan Shalkurova. When her whereabouts were traced, it emerged that Bayan had been attempting to travel to Shymkent, apparently in the process of leaving the city. She was intercepted and brought in for questioning. What followed was one of the more striking features of this case, a series of shifting, contradictory, and ultimately unconvincing explanations that investigators would have to work through one by one. In her initial statements, Bayan maintained the same story she had given Ulzhan's mother over the phone. She claimed she had already moved out of the apartment and had no relevant knowledge of what may have happened there. As investigators confronted her with physical evidence that directly undermined that account, her story evolved. In a second version, she described a terrifying scenario. She claimed that two unknown young men had forced their way into the apartment, committed the violent act, and threatened both her life and her family's safety if she spoke to anyone. She said she had taken some of Ulzhan's belongings because she needed money to flee the city and feared she would be held responsible for a crime she had not committed. She insisted the threats against her had been real and that she had been too frightened to contact police. Investigators examined this account carefully and found it unsupported by any available evidence. Bayan was unable to provide descriptions detailed enough to produce meaningful composite images of the men she described. More critically, surveillance cameras mounted on neighboring buildings captured the entrance to the apartment building during the relevant timeframe, and the footage showed no young men matching any description Bayan offered entering or leaving the premises that evening. As each new inconsistency was identified, Bayan's story shifted again, with new details added that appeared tailored to align with whatever evidence investigators had most recently disclosed to her. When it became apparent that this approach was failing, she eventually settled on a final account that would be presented to the court during formal proceedings. According to this last version, Ulzhan had returned from her classes on October 9th in an agitated and confrontational state. An argument broke out between the two young women. Bayan claimed that Ulzhan was the one who escalated the confrontation to physical violence, and that in the chaos of the struggle she had no choice but to defend herself. She picked up the first object within reach, which she said turned out to be a hammer. In the course of the struggle, she claimed, she accidentally struck Ulzhan on the head. Ulzhan fell. Bayan then stated that she lost control of herself in a state of extreme psychological distress, something described in legal terminology as a sudden emotional overload, and continued to strike Ulzhan across multiple parts of her body. She pointed to shallow cuts on her own hands as evidence that she had been wounded during the confrontation and had acted in self-defense. The prosecution and forensic experts systematically dismantled this version. The medical evidence indicated that the blunt force trauma to Ulzhan's skull came from behind, which was inconsistent with a face-to-face struggle in which Ulzhan had allegedly attacked first. Experts noted that the pattern and position of the injury did not support the idea that Ulzhan had been in any position to launch an aggressive attack immediately before the blow was delivered. The psychological defense of extreme emotional overload also drew scrutiny. The nature and extent of the injuries indicated a degree of sustained and deliberate action that was difficult to reconcile with the description of a momentary, uncontrolled reaction. As for the cuts on Bayan's hands, forensic analysis observed that their location on her palms and fingers was more consistent with the kind of injury a person sustains when wielding a bladed weapon with significant force than with an injury received while defending against an attack. These were telling details, and each one added weight to the prosecution's position. 2 charges were filed against Bayan Shalkurova, the unlawful taking of a life carried out with particular cruelty, and theft. When formal court proceedings began, the prosecution built its case around the argument that the motivating force behind the attack had been long-simmering jealousy and resentment that had finally found a violent outlet. Prosecutors presented security footage from cameras mounted on the exterior of neighboring buildings that clearly captured Bayan exiting the apartment building on multiple occasions in the aftermath of the incident, carrying bags and items that turned out to belong to Ulzhan. Among the materials she removed were not only personal valuables and electronics, but also bedding from the apartment that had been contaminated with evidence from the attack, apparently removed in an effort to conceal what had occurred. A portion of the stolen items was recovered by investigators. Ulzhan's mobile phone was not among them. Bayan acknowledged having disposed of it deliberately to eliminate a potential link back to her. The device was never found. Digital records recovered from Ulzhan's personal computer and other storage devices provided a further and important dimension to the case. They contradicted the picture Bayan had initially tried to present to police, a picture of a harmonious, respectful friendship. In fact, Ulzhan's private communications and messages told a very different story. She had been writing to her family for a considerable time about the difficulties of living with Bayan, describing a pattern of hostile and toxic behavior that, according to Ulzhan's own words, had begun almost from the very first days of their cohabitation. She had expressed a clear and persistent wish to have Bayan removed from the apartment. She had tried on multiple occasions to resolve the situation. It is possible, investigators acknowledged, that the events of October 9th began as yet another attempt by Ulzhan to address this ongoing conflict, and that it was precisely that attempt which triggered the devastating response that followed. The character contrast between the two young women that emerged during the trial was sharp. Every individual who knew Ulzhan personally spoke of her in consistent terms, as someone who was positive, compassionate, generous, and fundamentally decent. Not a single person who had known her could point to a history of volatile behavior or irrational aggression on her part. The characterizations of Bayan were strikingly different. Those who knew her described a young woman prone to explosive anger, unpredictable reactions, and a notable inability to regulate her own emotions or behavior in moments of conflict. The defense continued to argue throughout the trial that the authorities had not investigated all possible avenues thoroughly, and that the true perpetrators might remain unidentified and free. The defense introduced the suggestion that another individual, described by Bayan as a woman of Uzbek origin with a known grievance against Ulzhan, might have played a role in events. The prosecution dismissed these suggestions as speculation unsupported by any evidence, pointing out that every person in Ulzhan's life had been interviewed, and not one of them had mentioned any person or relationship that might provide a credible alternative explanation for what had happened. At the conclusion of the trial, the court found Bayan Shalkarova guilty on both counts. She was sentenced to 16 years of imprisonment to be served in a strict regime correctional facility. The court also ordered her to pay financial compensation of 780,000 Kazakhstani tenge to the Ryskulbekova family to account for material losses suffered as a result of the theft. For Ulzhan's family, the verdict provided no sense of resolution. Her mother and sister had been vocal throughout the investigation and the trial, speaking with journalists and insisting that fundamental questions about the case had never been properly addressed. They did not argue in Bayan's favor, and they did not dispute her guilt, but they were deeply and persistently convinced that she had not acted alone. The family's central concern was a practical one, rooted in the physical realities of the crime scene rather than speculation. The carpet in which Ulzhan's body had been found was large and heavy. Ulzhan herself was a young adult woman. Rolling a body of that size into a carpet, moving it from the apartment, carrying or dragging it down multiple flights of stairs, and depositing it near the basement entrance without attracting attention from neighbors would have required considerable physical strength and effort, and Bayan was by all accounts a small, slight young woman with no particular physical advantage. Ulzhan's mother and sister visited the apartment building themselves and came away more convinced than before that this could not have been accomplished alone. The carpet was simply too unwieldy, too heavy, and the stairwell too confined for one small person to have managed without creating enough noise or visible exertion to alert anyone in the building. They argued that the absence of an accomplice from the surveillance footage was not proof that no accomplice existed. Someone living in the same building or hiding with a neighbor could have avoided the cameras entirely. The family submitted formal complaints to law enforcement on multiple occasions, urging authorities to broaden the scope of the investigation and look again at whether anyone else had been involved. Those complaints were not acted upon. Prosecutors later stated publicly that the investigative team had examined every version of events raised during the inquiry, including all accounts involving third parties, and had found no credible evidence to support the conclusion that more than one person was responsible for what happened on October 9th. Authorities offered the explanation that extreme stress and adrenaline can enable a person to accomplish physical feats well beyond their normal capacity, and suggested this was the most plausible explanation for how Bayan, alone and in a heightened emotional state, could have moved the body. The Ryskulbekova family remained unconvinced. They escalated their efforts, drafting formal complaints to the office of the president and exploring the possibility of engaging members of parliament to bring additional scrutiny to the case. As of the information available from this case, those efforts did not produce the deeper reinvestigation the family had sought. Ulzhan Ryskulbekova was 21 years old when her life was taken. She had moved to a new city with nothing but determination and a willingness to work hard. She had built a life for herself through her own effort, earned the respect of everyone around her, and given her trust to someone who repaid it with violence. Her family's search for complete answers has never truly ended, and the questions they carry with them remain as heavy as the grief itself. This case became one of the more discussed criminal proceedings in Kazakhstan in recent years, not only because of the nature of the crime, but because of the haunting possibility that the full picture of what happened in that Astana apartment on the evening of October 9, 2015, may never fully come to light.